My mother-in-law hosted a welcome party for my husband's ex, so I let her play the whole hand. There is a specific type of silence that happens right before a calculated strike. It isn't loud, and it certainly isn't aggressive. It's the quiet, chilling pause where you watch someone dig their own grave, perfectly convinced they are building a throne. For 3 years, my mother-in-law, Eleanor, treated our marriage like a temporary inconvenience. To her, I was simply the woman occupying a seat meant for someone else, someone she had handpicked a decade ago. That someone was Serafina. Serafina was polished, came from the right zip code, and possessed the exact brand of passive-aggressive elegance that Eleanor worshipped. When Serafina returned to the city after years abroad, Eleanor didn't just welcome her back. She orchestrated an elaborate high-society dinner party under the guise of a community charity launch, positioning Serafina as the guest of honor right in front of my husband Julian and me. Eleanor thought she was setting a masterfully subtle psychological trap to humiliate me, shake my confidence, and make Julian regret his choices. What she didn't realize was that I had spent years studying her playbook. I knew every look, every whispered implication, and every structural weakness in her social armor. I didn't cause a scene, I didn't cry, and I didn't demand that we leave. Instead, I sat at the head of her beautifully decorated table, smiled warmly, and let Eleanor play her entire hand exactly the way she wanted. By the time the final course was served, the trap she had meticulously built for me had snapped shut around her own reputation. This is the story of how a quiet observation can dismantle decades of social manipulation, and how true control belongs to the person who refuses to react. The invitation arrived not in the mail, but left carelessly on our kitchen island, positioned precisely where I would see it the moment I came home from work. It was a heavy, cream-colored cardstock with Eleanor's signature calligraphy. The event was billed as an intimate welcome-back dinner and fundraiser for a local heritage foundation, but the subtext was written in invisible ink. Serafina was back, and I was expected to watch her reclamation of the family circle. Julian was uncomfortable the second he saw it. He looked at me, his eyes scanning my face for the inevitable flash of hurt or anger, but I didn't give it to him. Instead, I mirrored his calmness. Julian had dated Serafina for 4 years during college and early law school, a relationship that ended because Serafina chose an international career opportunity over a life with him. Eleanor had never forgiven Julian for moving on, and she certainly had never forgiven me for being the woman he chose to build a quiet, stable life with. "We don't have to go, Evelyn," Julian said, his voice laced with genuine concern. "My mother is being transparent, even for her. We can easily make an excuse. And let her tell the entire social circle that I was too intimidated to show up," I replied, offering him a reassuring smile. "Absolutely not. We are going, Julian. We'll support the charity, and we will be the perfect guests." The days leading up to the party were filled with subtle psychological warfare. Eleanor called Julian multiple times, ensuring he knew exactly what Serafina had achieved abroad, dropping hints about how radiant she looked, and casually mentioning how much she missed the old days. I listened to these conversations from the next room, noting the exact narrative Eleanor was trying to construct. She wanted me insecure. She wanted me to dress defensively, act defensively, and ultimately make a scene that would prove I didn't belong in their elevated social tier. The evening of the dinner, the air was crisp. Eleanor's estate was fully illuminated, the long driveway lined with perfect, pristine white lights. As we stepped into the grand foyer, the murmur of high society chatter drifted from the main dining hall. Eleanor spotted us immediately. She glided across the polished hardwood, dressed in emerald silk, her expression a masterclass in manufactured warmth. "Evelyn, darling, you made it," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness as she grazed my cheek with her hand. "And Julian, my handsome boy. Come. Someone is absolutely dying to see you." She didn't take us toward the hosts or the foundation board members. She guided us directly toward the grand fireplace, where Serafina stood, surrounded by a small, attentive court of Eleanor's closest friends. Serafina looked exactly as Eleanor had described, impeccable, wearing a tailored cream dress that practically screamed old money. "Serafina, look who finally arrived," Eleanor announced, her hand resting firmly on Julian's arm, effectively pushing me to the periphery of the group. Serafina turned, her eyes locking onto Julian first, with a look of soft, lingering nostalgia, before drifting to me with a polite, slightly pitying smile. "Julian, it's been a lifetime, and you must be Evelyn. Eleanor has told me some things about you." The implication was clear, delivered with the practiced ease of someone used to dominating social spaces. The surrounding women went quiet, waiting to see how the middle-class girl who married the Vance heir would handle the blatant slight. "It's a pleasure to meet you." "Serafina," I said, my voice steady, my posture relaxed. Eleanor speaks of the past quite often, so I feel like I already know all the old stories. "Welcome back to the city." I watched Eleanor's jaw tighten slightly. She hadn't expected me to welcome the comparison so easily. The first move belonged to them. But the game was just beginning. As the cocktail hour progressed, Eleanor's strategy became increasingly transparent. She had arranged the evening to systematically exclude me from conversations by focusing entirely on shared memories, local country club politics, and elite circles from a decade ago. Every time I attempted to contribute a thought on current events or local developments, Eleanor would smoothly pivot the topic back to something only she, Julian, and Serafina shared. "Do you remember that summer in Martha's Vineyard, Julian?" Eleanor asked loudly, ensuring the nearby guests could hear. "The year Serafina won the sailing regatta? We had the most magnificent celebration at the yacht club. It truly felt like the family was complete back then." Julian looked deeply uncomfortable, clearing his throat. "Mother, that was a long time ago. Evelyn and I actually went to the vineyard last year for our anniversary, and the new harbor development is incredible." "Oh, I'm sure it's nice for tourists," Serafina chimed in, a soft laugh escaping her lips. "But the private docks are where the real charm is. I suppose you didn't get a chance to experience that, Evelyn." "We preferred the quiet trails and the local history, actually," I replied, maintaining direct, calm eye contact. "The commercialized areas tend to feel a bit performative." A subtle ripple of amusement went through one of the older gentlemen standing nearby, a prominent board member who valued substance over show. Eleanor noticed this and immediately shifted her tactics, signaling the staff that it was time for dinner to be served. When we entered the dining room, the seating arrangement was the ultimate confirmation of Eleanor's intent. Instead of seating me next to my husband, Eleanor had placed Julian directly between herself and Serafina at the center of the long table. I was relegated to the far end, seated next to a quiet, elderly uncle who was hard of hearing, and across from a local historian who seemed completely out of place among the wealthy donors. It was a blatant public demotion, a visual representation of where Eleanor believed I belonged. Julian looked at the place cards and immediately stepped toward me. "Evelyn, this is ridiculous. Let's just swap cards." "No, Julian," I whispered, holding his arm gently. "Sit where your mother placed you. Enjoy your evening. I am going to be perfectly fine right here." As the first course was served, Eleanor began her performance. From across the long table, I watched her orchestrate a narrative of deep intimacy between Julian and Serafina. She constantly brought up inside jokes, asked Serafina to remind Julian of specific moments from their past, and physically leaned in, creating a private wall that effectively shut Julian off from the rest of the table. Serafina played along flawlessly, her gestures elegant, her tone soft and appealing. To the outside observer, it looked like a reunion of star-crossed lovers, blessed by the matriarch herself. The guests at the center of the table began to take the cue, whispering among themselves about how beautiful Serafina looked next to Julian, and how it was a shame things had worked out the way they did. But while Eleanor was focused on her center stage performance, she completely ignored what was happening at my end of the table. I didn't sit in sullen silence. Instead, I turned my full attention to the man across from me, Dr. Phillips, the quiet historian who Eleanor had placed at the edge of the room as an afterthought. I began asking him about his latest research on the city's early architecture, a topic I genuinely found fascinating. Dr. Phillips's eyes lit up. For the next hour, we engaged in a deeply intellectual, engaging conversation. The hard-of-hearing uncle joined in, his sharp mind activated by the topic. Slowly, the energy at our end of the table shifted from polite isolation to genuine, vibrant engagement. Our laughter was natural, our conversation substantive. I caught Eleanor glancing down the table multiple times, her brows furrowing. She had expected to see me sitting in miserable isolation, a victim of her social exclusion. Instead, she saw a woman entirely unbothered, commanding her own small, intellectually superior circle without shouting for attention. Her trap was failing to produce the psychological damage she desired, which meant she was about to escalate. By the time the main course arrived, Eleanor could no longer stand the division of attention. She needed the entire room to witness my public eclipse. She tapped her crystal wine glass with a silver spoon, the sharp ringing sound instantly silencing the dining room. "Everyone, if I could have your attention for just a moment," Eleanor announced, standing up, her emerald silk shimmering under the chandelier. "Tonight is not just about our wonderful Heritage Foundation. It is also a deeply personal celebration for the Vance family. As many of you know, Chloe has spent the last 5 years managing incredible philanthropic efforts in Europe. She has returned home to bring that immense talent back to our community." The room applauded politely. Chloe smiled warmly, dipping her head in practiced modesty. "When Chloe was a part of our lives daily, Eleanor continued, her eyes drifting down the table and locking onto mine with a cold, triumphant gleam. She brought a level of grace, sophistication, and cultural understanding that this family has sorely missed. She understood the weight of the Vance legacy. Now that she is back, I am thrilled to announce that I have personally appointed her as the permanent chair of the Vance Family Trust's Cultural Committee. A collective murmur went through the room. The family trust was incredibly exclusive, and appointing an ex-girlfriend to manage its cultural assets was a direct, unmistakable insult to the current wife. It was a declaration that I was incompetent to handle the family's public legacy. Julian stood up immediately, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Mother, this is completely inappropriate. You did not discuss this with me, and as a trustee— Julian, please, Eleanor interrupted, her voice smooth, cutting him off with maternal authority. This is business and culture. We must choose the most qualified individual to represent our name. Chloe has the pedigree, the international connections, and the innate understanding of our values. We cannot let sentimentality dictate our legacy. Chloe looked over at me, a tiny, victorious smirk playing at the corners of her lips. The entire room turned to look at me, waiting for the tears, the outburst, or the humiliated departure. I took a slow sip of my water, set the glass down, and stood up. The room held its breath. Eleanor is absolutely right, I said, my voice projecting clearly across the silent room. I walked slowly down the length of the table, my posture straight, my expression entirely serene. Legacy should never be dictated by mere sentimentality. It requires transparency, dedication, and an unblemished commitment to the community. I stopped right behind Dr. Phillips, placing a gentle hand on the back of his chair, which is exactly why, when Dr. Phillips informed me last month about the structural vulnerabilities and historical preservation issues facing the city's oldest districts, I took it upon myself to act. Over the last 3 weeks, I worked alongside the Municipal Archive Board to officially secure a federal historical landmark status for the entire foundational district. The room went completely still. Dr. Phillips smiled broadly, nodding in confirmation. What this means for the Vance Family Trust, I continued, looking directly at Eleanor, whose expression was beginning to freeze, is that the Cultural Committee no longer has unilateral control over these properties. Every project, every donation, and every structural change must now pass through a strict, publicly audited federal review board, a board that I was invited to chair this morning. I turned my gaze to Chloe, my smile warm and entirely devoid of malice. So Chloe, I want to congratulate you on your appointment. I look forward to reviewing your committee's proposals. Just ensure your paperwork is thoroughly vetted. The federal guidelines are notoriously unforgiving to those who don't understand the local legal framework. The psychological shift in the room was instantaneous. In a matter of seconds, Eleanor's grand gesture had been reduced to an empty, powerless title. Chloe was no longer entering a position of elite influence. She was entering a position where she would be directly accountable to me. The silence in the dining room was heavy, broken only by the sudden, enthusiastic applause of Dr. Phillips and the older board members who recognized the massive strategic victory I had just dropped on the table. Federal landmark status was something the Foundation had been trying to achieve for a decade, and I had quietly secured it without ever bragging or seeking validation until the exact moment it mattered. Eleanor slowly sank back into her chair, her face pale, her perfectly manicured hands trembling slightly against her napkin. She looked at Chloe, who was now staring at her plate, her face flushed with deep embarrassment. The illusion of their absolute control had evaporated. Julian looked at me, a profound look of pride and relief washing over his face. He sat back down, completely yielding the floor to me. Now, I said smoothly, gesturing to the servers, let us not keep the chef waiting. The main course looks absolutely spectacular. For the rest of the evening, the dynamic of the party completely shifted. The guests who had previously swarmed around Eleanor and Chloe began migrating to my end of the table. They wanted to know about the federal board, the preservation laws, and how this would elevate the city's national profile. I answered every question with grace, inclusion, and humility, ensuring Dr. Phillips received the credit he deserved for his research. Eleanor sat in near isolation at the center of her own table, watching her guests abandon her constructed narrative to align themselves with the reality of actual influence. Chloe made a quiet excuse about a headache shortly after dessert was served and slipped out the back exit, realizing that her return to the social scene had been entirely compromised by Eleanor's overplayed hand. When the dinner finally concluded, Julian and I stood in the grand foyer saying goodbye to the departing guests. Every single person shook my hand with newfound respect, recognizing that the Vance family dynamics had fundamentally changed. Eleanor approached us last, the grand foyer now empty and quiet. The emerald silk no longer looked triumphant. It looked heavy. She couldn't even bring herself to look me in the eye. You think you're very clever, don't you, Evelyn? She whispered, her voice stripped of its artificial sweetness, leaving only the bitter residue of her defeat. I don't think I'm clever, Eleanor. Eleanor, I replied, my tone soft, completely devoid of anger. I just believe in substance over performance. You spent the entire evening trying to use the past to humiliate me, but the past is a ghost. I am building the future, with Julian, and with this community. I gave you every opportunity tonight to be a gracious host. You chose to play a game, and I simply allowed you to finish it. Julian stepped forward, wrapping his arm firmly around my waist. We're going home now, Mother. Thank you for a wonderful dinner. The layout was unforgettable. As we walked down the grand stone steps of the estate toward our car, the night air felt incredibly refreshing. I didn't feel a sense of petty triumph. I felt a deep, profound peace. I had protected my marriage, my dignity, and my position without ever lowering myself to the toxic tactics used against me. In the passenger seat, Julian reached over, taking my hand in his. You were incredible tonight. I've never seen anyone handle my mother like that. Your mother played her entire hand, Julian, I said, looking out at the city lights ahead of us. The trouble with playing all your cards at once is that you're left completely empty-handed when the game actually begins.